Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Kind of continuing with the series, I've asked a bunch of kind of colleagues, friends, experts, advisors to come on this, and we're jumping on the Zoom bandwagon of having these conversations we would normally film in person, but of course keeping social distance to try to shorten the amount of time that we have to go through all this stuff. And so today I've invited Harp Sandhu onto the channel. Harp and I have known each other for probably 5 or 6 years. We've done a lot of business together. He's become a good friend. And as most of you know, even though I'm Canadian, I spend a lot of time working in the US. And I found it really challenging to understand how to jump between the Canada Revenue Agency and the IRS. And so Harp is really my go-to guy when it comes to how I'm moving money back and forth across the border legally. I've never been one of those donkeys that decides to be a Canadian and keep an address in the US that's a fake address in order to try to game the system. More and more people are getting caught on that, and it's becoming a dangerous thing to do. And so I invited Harp on because a lot of my Canadian clients actually work down in the US for Google, Apple, American Airlines, Alaska Airlines, and so on. He's the person that I tend to refer them to when they need to consider what they're doing with their investments. Tax advice, even, because he's got a whole group, an army of professionals that do this cross-border stuff. He's even helped clients get cars and whiskey collections back in the country. And so Harp's going to answer just some of the common questions that come up. So Harp, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so one of the things maybe we can start with right off the back is, how does the cross-border advising thing happen, and why is Raymond James uniquely positioned to offer this to Canadians who've worked down in the US?
Great question. So one of the biggest things is that we essentially are the same firm on both sides of the border. While other firms have third-party relationships with companies that can offer the services, our headquarters is in St. Petersburg, Florida. Which is Raymond James Financial. Raymond James Financial owns Raymond James Limited Canada, and then our Canadian subsidiary, if you want to call it, has a subsidiary known as RJLU, Raymond James Limited USA, which is licensed into the United States. So my US licensing doesn't go through Florida, it goes through Vancouver, but essentially we are Raymond James on both sides of the border.
So you're uniquely kind of positioned to help Canadians that might have investments, and not necessarily at Raymond James USA, but they might be with another firm. And do I understand it correctly that when a Canadian's moving back home after maybe working for a company and having what do they call a 401k? What do they call them down there?
Yeah, the 401k is a company sponsored retirement plan, and then it's sort of like group RSPs here in Canada. And then what you've got as well is what we call IRAs, which are kind of like the US equivalent of a Canadian RSP.
Right. And so I had it in my head before you corrected me that the normal play was, you might have a Morgan Stanley or a Bank of America brokerage down in the US that might be holding these investments. And up until when you kind of brought me up to speed, I always assumed that Canadians were forced to just liquidate those accounts, take the cash. The argument would be made, the American dollar is worth more than the Canadian dollar, so you're paying a big tax bill with the IRS, but you get the conversion when you come back to Canada. But you maybe can explain why that's not necessarily the case, where you don't have to liquidate out your assets and take the major tax hit.
Right, you absolutely don't. And I mean, there is a procedure where you can transfer your assets out of your US retirement account into a Canadian retirement account. So you take your IRA and you ultimately end up with it inside of your RSP. The issue is there are tax implications, and when it used to be the only option available, it kind of made sense. But the fact is that with a firm like ours, you can move back to Canada, you can maintain your IRA. We leave it domiciled down there. We're not moving it to Canada, but we can manage it from up here, and we're licensed to do so. There have been times when clients have taken an IRA and cashed it out and then deposited it into the RSP, but you do end up initially, there's a tax bill involved, and then there's foreign tax credits involved. And sometimes it's not a one-off sort of one-to-one offset in what you're doing. And now, especially because we can manage them from here, you really don't need to do that. Although we will always consult with the tax advisor. There may be reasons to do it that way.
And you have those tax advisors here in Canada, right? So people who understand that cross-border stuff as well.
Exactly. We work with Victoria has 4 or 5 firms of U.S. licensed tax accountants that are cross-border accountants. So they know the Canadian rules, but they also know the U.S. rules quite well. So they're well versed in both CRA and IRS rules. What we've found is most accountants that are in the United States, they're very good at IRS tax law. They know it, but not as well versed in Canadian tax law. It's such a small market for them. They tend not to get licensed or trained in it. So the cross-border accounts we work with are all located here in Canada.
Right. So maybe you can give, I always find, because it's not my area of expertise, I learn best through stories. And so maybe you could share a couple of the stories or situations where clients, you know, who were in the US found their way working back home to Canada, and kind of what that process looked like the role that you played. Because I know you've shared, and I'd like you maybe a little bit later to share the whiskey story, right? About like,
Right.
as a big whiskey guy, I always assumed you had to drink it before you could bring it back. But maybe talk about a couple of situations where people had moved back, or I know there was one where wasn't there an American mom that there was an inheritance to a Canadian from an American parent or something like that? But maybe give a couple of
Right.
those.
Yeah, the common situations we see are either a Canadian who has lived in the US for quite a while. Maybe they moved down there, you know, they moved into California to work in the tech sector, or they moved to, you know, Texas to work in the oil sector, and now they're coming back. And while they were down there, they, you know, they've got investment accounts, they've got retirement accounts. Sometimes it's 2 Canadians coming back. It might be a case of a Canadian who went down single and is now coming back married with a spouse and children, or it's a situation of a U.S. person that's leaving the U.S. and coming to Canada. And then there's the inheritance story as well. You could have someone who just has always lived in Canada, but perhaps mom and dad had moved down to the U.S., stayed there. This child happened to live here in Canada the whole time, and now they're inheriting their parents' assets. And a lot of people think, well, hold on, how can a Canadian inherit a US based retirement account? And the answer is that you can. So there's a number of different scenarios that we encounter where we're able to turn around and help them manage their assets, but also keep everything basically under one roof. So using the example of the inheritance, we had a client living here in Canada, and their parents had always lived in the US, and they passed away, and they inherited not only the regular, what, you know, we call them cash accounts up here in the US, they're referred to as taxable accounts, the open investment account. Those accounts will actually transfer onto our Canadian platform, but we can maintain US funds if we want to. For the retirement accounts, we can actually open a retirement account in the United States for someone living in Canada, and then they inherit into that account. That way they don't have to cash the whole thing out, you know, deal with taxes and pay a large potential tax bill.
So how many people do you think know about this? Because I know, like, I'm in a group because I've had an office in Seattle since 2003, and I'm on a group called Canadians Working in Seattle. And it seems like every week a question comes up about, you know, I have a rental property in Canada, but I still live in the US, or I'm moving home. What do I do with my 401k? Would it be kind of your experience that most investment firms, aside from Raymond James in the US, are unaware that this can kind of actually happen, where if they have to get rid of that account anyway, right, because they can't hold it once a Canadian has moved home, do most of them actually, are they aware of that RJ platform? Because it seems like like kind of the best kept secret in how to preserve kind of that big hit on a tax bill. And I've always said to clients, just cash out the money, and you can bring it in and, you know, get the benefit on the Canadian dollar. But how many people in the US actually know about this?
That's a great point, and a lot of them don't. In the old days, what would happen was, you know, the advisors would want to maintain the client relationship, and they would just sort of try and carry on working with the client. You know, you mentioned the fake address thing, and that was one way of doing it. things have changed a lot. And what you're seeing now is the way that the clients are finding out about it is either they've already made the move, they've left their investments down there, they go in and talk to their accountant who finally tells them, hey, do you know there's someone local that can handle all this for you without using fake addresses and breaking with regulations. Or you'll get, you're on that Facebook group. I've had some contacts that way, but a lot of people don't know. What's interesting is I've had a number of cases where fairly large clients have moved up and we've taken them on. In the normal course of business, just being an advisor here in Canada, whenever you take on a new client, you're generally taking that client from someone else. It's a competitive situation, and for various reasons, clients do move around. And usually it's it's not the friendliest situation when you're moving a client from another advisor. It's hard to get some information that you might need because again, it's competitive. What I've found in the US is almost in every case when a client has left their advisor in the United States, they've made clear to that advisor, it's been great working with you. I trust you implicitly, but I've moved now and I can't continue working with you. And we'll get in touch with those advisors as we're moving the accounts. And the good ones, what's amazing is they're relieved. I've got a situation where a woman who lost her husband, left Idaho, moved back to the mainland to be close to her family. And in moving the account over, and it was in the millions of dollars, and we were talking to the other advisor, and he was really happy that, wow, someone can look after her. Please take care of her. She's been a good client for a long time. I care about her. And then they provided a lot of information out of the file that you normally don't get when you transfer a client on. So I've had a couple of cases where we've taken a client on that way, where a month or two later, the same advisor has actually called us back saying, hey, I have another one. I have this other client that's leaving. Are you able to look after them? So now we're slowly, it's maybe 1% of them know, but what we're trying to do is make sure they do. I've made a point of reaching out to firms just to introduce myself and let them know, look, if you ever come across this situation, we're here and we can help. You'll get situations like with the inheritance, for instance. There was 3 siblings besides my client. The 3 of them were down in the US. So that advisor maintains most of that relationship. Mom and dad's accounts go to the other kids, which, that advisor keeps working with. But then they realize that this other client is also being taken care of, and they don't have to cash things out and pay a bunch of taxes. And they're relieved that 4th sibling, who is a child of their long-term client, is going to get taken care of, and there's someone here.
And so I guess what I'm hearing is advisors that are really client-centric, they're not crying over spilt milk in regards to, hey, I'm losing an account, so screw it. Those advisors that are really in it for the right reason in the US would be like, listen, if I can't legally hold this account anymore without, I don't know if it's called fraud, but if you're using an address that is not your client's primary address, there's probably some consequences down the road on that. And so I would assume that if they know they have to get it off their books, having a solution probably just makes their life easier. It's gone anyway. Might as well make sure it goes to the right home where their client's going to continue to be cared for.
Absolutely. It just, part of this business is clients do move on, sometimes under not so good circumstances. Other times, they're moving, they're leaving the country. Or we've had cases where clients have left British Columbia and maybe moved back east, and we tried to make it work for a while. And after that, they felt they wanted someone local, so we passed them on to someone local. And I think if you're doing these for the right reasons and you're worrying about your clients, then it makes sense to help them out and make their transition as easy as possible. And at the same time, though, we've had the odd case where a client perhaps has gone the other way and they do want someone local. So I have these contacts now that I can reach out to and say, listen, I'm allowed, with the way my licensing works, I'm fully registered in Canada, but I'm also fully registered with FINRA and the SEC in the US. I could just go down and start prospecting for business of clients that have nothing to do with Canada and live in the US. There's enough advisors down there. There's Raymond James has advisors, other firms have advisors. So whenever we have a situation where, again, it's a family situation, and some of them are in the US and some are in Canada, we'll let those advisors know, look, you look after the US relationship. We'll take care of the Canadian relationship and work together to make sure the clients are taken care of.
So it's really an abundance mindset. It's not all me or it's all you. It's how do we work in the best kind of way for what the client needs and their family needs, I guess.
Absolutely. And as much as we're similar to the US, we're also very different. And, when clients live in Canada, we tend to own a lot of Canadian-based investments as well. Whereas, in the US, Canada is just a very small portion of foreign developed markets to them. So if they're going to live here, plus there's the foreign exchange issues as well, it just makes sense to have someone local, at least in the same country that you're living in. And going back to that example of the address, so in the old days, and we've had a case like this that we had to help an accountant work with, where the client moved to Canada, and this was a number of years ago. The advisor didn't want to lose the client, and they lived in California, so they sort of said, hey, do you have a mom and dad, a cousin, a brother, a friend who lives here? And they did. So they used the California address as their address with the brokerage firm. What that does is it tricks the compliance of that firm into thinking, okay, this is a US based client, because the regulators say that the advisor needs to be licensed where the client lives and where the money lives. So if you have a situation where the money's left in California, but the client lives here in Canada, that advisor in the US could deal with the client if they were licensed in Canada. And to our knowledge, there are no US based advisors that are licensed in Canada. We're just too small of a market. So that relationship carries on for 3 or 4 years. The client lives up here. They like their advisor. They're just running things normally. Money gets wired to bank accounts as needed, until all of a sudden the state of California comes along to the client and says, hey, you haven't filed taxes in California for the last 4 years that you've lived here. And the client says, well, no, I don't really live there. I just, and California doesn't care. So now there's potential penalties, there's backfiling of taxes.
What you mean is it's not that they don't care as in, okay, fine, you don't have to pay taxes. You've said you have an address here, regardless if you're here or not, you're paying taxes and back taxes with penalties.
Yeah, you essentially claimed that you lived in California with your brokerage firm. So we're going to tax you like you lived in California. And then the accountants have to get involved. And there's the fees involved in filing and becoming compliant. And there's also potential penalties. So that's where the fake address thing is not working anymore. And then what's happening is the firms are really cracking down on that out of the US. They're making it very clear to their advisors, we're not going to maintain these relationships. The fines can be way too high. It's a real small market for us. So we're not going to do it.
So they're forcing their advisors to get these Canadians off their platform, but the advisors are probably just saying, cash it in, bring it as a cashier's note to Canada and find it. Like, they're not, the people that might not know about this solution are probably stuck in the old model of cash it out, you can't have it here anymore, and go with God, hope it works out for you back in Canada.
Absolutely. They kind of tell them, look, we don't know how to help you. You got to go. And when you talk about the forcing, is there's been situations where clients have gotten letters saying, you have 15 or 30 or 60 days to move your accounts, or we're going to cash everything out and send you a check. So imagine, just think of it from a Canadian perspective. You're living in the United States and your advisor in Canada says, we are cashing out your RSP and sending you a check. Well, it's fully taxable income. So there's major tax implications. And a lot of times clients get that letter and they panic and they don't know what to do. And sometimes they'll talk to a non-cross-border licensed advisor. They'll talk them into sometimes, yeah, let's cash out your RSP or your IRA and then we'll move it up here. I remember one of the accountants that I first met 5 years ago when I really started doing the cross-border, and the first questions he asked me were, what's the address you're going to use for the client? Are you going to try and get me to talk the client into cashing out the retirement account and moving it into it? The answers were no, we're not. We're going to run it from up here. We're going to domicile it in the US, but we're fully licensed down there so we can manage.
Right. So one of the things I think people would be interested in, and it's not financial related, even though it is that client that you helped me with who was moving up from Arizona that needed to bring a car in. I always had in my head that you would only do the investment side, but I was, privy to, I guess, watching from the sidelines, you doing a lot more than that, including, the Paul who you have worked with, kind of relocation, and you have immigration people, but even the car, right? You helped bring that car in. And so maybe just share with people some of the different things, and the whiskey might be a good time to talk about the whiskey collection. But the car thing I found interesting, because even when clients would be moving home, I'm like, well, if you can't get your car in, just sell it. Like, my assumption was it was harder than it actually is to get a car in, but you got to know what to do. And so maybe share a little bit about that.
Exactly. And that was one of the things when we first started doing this, you're looking after the investments, but I started taking on more and more clients, I realized there was a whole other world that went with this. These clients are leaving a country that they've lived in for maybe 30 or 40 years. They have a lot going on. They're picking up their house, they're doing all the moving. So we just slowly started learning about, the other services and how I don't provide those services, but I can provide the contact. So where the car part came from was I actually, other than the vehicle I have now, my last two vehicles I bought through an auto broker. He's a friend of mine named Johannes, and he would pick up cars from auctions and lease backs and whatnot. So I reached out to him, and I actually had a really good friend that picked up a Toyota Tundra out of Seattle, and he did it all himself. And when he was done with it, he told me just how much of a pain it was and how he'd never do it again. You got to go down there. When you get to customs, you have to go in and file some paperwork, and then you have to wait 72 hours for things to clear. You can't cross the border technically. You got to wait at the border town, and then they clear your car and you bring it over. So through that connection with my broker, he introduced me to one of his contacts that's at the Peace Arch crossing, and it's a company that does importing and exporting of vehicles. For about $200 US, they'll file all your paperwork for you. You show up at the border, and what they do is they file it more than 72 hours prior to you showing up there. So when you get there, you go into, now you have to, even though you're crossing into Canada, you first go into the US Customs office, let them know who you are, they find your paperwork, they stamp it, and then you cross in. What it is you have to export your car out of the US. It's not so much importing it into Canada, but it's exporting it out of the US. So there's a process that you can either do it yourself, pull your hair out, it's a pain, or you pay a couple $100 and have it all done for you. So that's one of the contacts we have, and we'll make introductions for clients that need that. Some clients do still sell their car. They just find it easier. I'm just going to sell it down here. Others might say, look, I just bought this thing last year. I do want to bring it up with me. And that's how you do it. And then from there, locally, if they have to get it sort of Canadianized, there's an inspection that has to get done. They have to get through ICBC. But we have a whole process that will let them know that they have to follow, and then we'll connect them with the insurance people, the car inspection people. So that's a big part of it.
So you're really trying to just simplify that process. I mean, it's stressful as hell. I mean, I've been going back and forth across the border since 2003. And I know that when people are coming home, when their career is done, or if they get transitioned right back into Canada, the stress level with our clients is enormous, right? They've got enough to, managing career and or business, and then to think of getting it all back in. So you've probably seen most of what has to happen. I mean, there's probably the odd thing that you haven't seen. But the whiskey thing I found interesting because, again, I think what we think is you give away the whiskey or you try to drink it before you bring it back. But if you have a collection, but you found some interesting information about how that works.
Absolutely. It really is a concierge service for us now. We want to help them with the whole thing. With the whiskey collection, and actually that couple, they're relocating from Rochester, and they are coming in about 5 or 6 days here. So their house is packed up. They're staying in a hotel right now and making the move. And they purchased a place here in Victoria. And I remember it was about 9 months ago, we were on the phone together, and they were talking about how the wife was going to be coming in to check in on the renovation. And I jokingly said to the husband, I said, oh, so I guess you'll be having a big bachelor party this weekend, seeing as you're going to be alone. And he kind of chuckled, but he said, actually, you know what? I think I have to have a party. I have 58 bottles of whiskey in my collection, and I have to kind of get rid of them all before I make the move up. And I asked him why, and he said, well, the duties, they're crazy. And so, we talked about we had our conversation, and I kind of started thinking more and more of it. And I just on a whim, I picked up the phone and I called the BC Liquor Control Board, and I asked if there was any sort of program or place or how that would work when someone moves. And there's actually a program in place. It's called settler rates. So when you're moving from another country into Canada, on a one-time basis, they do have a program where it's not like, when you and I travel, we bring back one bottle. If we bring back a second bottle, the duties are brutal. And it's not just whiskey, it's all hard alcohol, it's wine, it's beer. But essentially, the way it works is there is a special duty of $8 per full bottle of whiskey or rum or vodka or whatever it might be. So, and what they do is they prorate it. If the bottle's only half full, you only pay $4 for it. So I found all this out, and I gathered the information from the Liquor Control Board. They sent me all the forms that have to be filled out. And I called my client and I said, hey, good news. You don't, if you haven't had that party yet, you don't have to, and here's why. And he said, of all the things I've done with you and you looking after my investments, this is the best of all. I can bring my 58 bottles of whiskey and it's hardly going to cost me any money. And I jokingly said, well, don't you have 100 bottles in your collection? And he kind of got, literally he could have gone out and bought a whole bunch more alcohol and had it in his collection as long as it was all together when he moved up here. So
previous to moving, he topped up his collection before he came.
Exactly. And I think he did top up his collection before he came. And so you're able to bring it back. And, even if you have 50 bottles at $8 and they're all full, you're going to pay $400 to bring it up here. Whereas if you brought 50 bottles, if you and I traveled down to California and tried to bring 50 bottles of whiskey back, we know what that would end up costing us.
Well, I do know it's 300% on tobacco and over alcohol. So I sadly know how much that costs. And so that's a hell of a deal, really.
Yeah, it worked out really well. And he's able to bring all of his collection with him. And so there's another part that we learned that this works. So we're always constantly trying to, whenever a client prevents a unique situation, for us, it's the ability to try and learn something new. And now we have it in our toolbox for next time, because we have another client now that's going to be leaving Texas in the next little while and moving up. And now we can, let them know, listen, if you have a collection of alcohol, don't worry about having to give it away. You can bring it with you.
So Harp, I'm going to put you on the spot because that's what I do. You're pretty good at answering questions for people that are, that kind of things pop up, especially professionals. And that tends to be the circle that I work in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put Harp's information with his permission down in the description box, where you can get a hold of him either by email or phone. Harp, I don't know which you prefer, maybe email and then phone. But maybe you can also, just so that people know, qualify kind of the types of professionals and business owners that you best work with, like what your practice kind of looks like now and the types of clients that you tend to focus on?
Sure. Yeah. And the information's fine. People can reach out to me if they have questions. With the cross-border, like when I look at my Canadian business, I tend to do a lot of work with retirees and business owners and medical professionals. It's kind of evolved that way. And they all have their own unique issues. It's not just about managing their money. There's everything else that goes around with it. And, and working with their accountants and lawyers. I kind of like to think of myself as the quarterback, where I'm going to make sure I reach out to the accountants, the lawyers, and make sure everything is taken care of. With the cross-border business, it varies. You have people that are retired and are moving up. You have people that I'm working with a fellow right now where he actually works for GoDaddy, and they've transferred him up to Canada. Usually it's people going the other way, but now you have people coming back this way. So, it can be trust accounts, it can be business owners, it can be retirees. But on the cross-border side, there is a big mix of the types of clients we work with, but generally their needs are fairly similar. The simplest ones are, a lot of times we get introduced to them after they've already moved. So they moved a year ago, everything's taken care of. They wish they had talked to me a year ago because I tell them the story about the car and all that, and they've gone through that pain. So the simplest ones are, we'll get a call, hey, I was talking to my accountant, he told me that you can help me with this, and all we're doing realistically is moving the investments over so that we can manage for them. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to catch that client prior to their move up. One of the things that has to happen is their investments need to be valued on the day of crossover in both Canadian and US dollars, because there's different tax implications. If you bought shares of Apple while you were living in California and then you moved to Canada, and then after living here for a while, you decided to sell them, there's the capital gains owed first to the US from when you bought them to the day you moved over, and then from the day you moved to the day you sold them, there's the CRA part of it. And they like to have it reported in local currency. So if we can get them before they move, it's a lot easier for us to value all the assets when they're on our platform, because we can just essentially print a report on the day of the move. So big cross section of the types of clients we work with. Essentially what they have for the most part is retirement accounts, IRAs, 401ks that we do something called a rollover. There's also the Roth IRA, and the Roth IRA is equivalent essentially to a tax-free savings account here in Canada. Along with that go all the various, there are some restrictions on the kinds of investments clients can and can't own. So, but for the most part, it's sort of integrating their US-based wealth with their Canadian wealth. The other benefit to that is if you're still leaving your wealth in the US by somehow, maybe you're still using a fake address or something, and then you've got your Canadian wealth with a Canadian advisor, you may have $1 million with each advisor. You get treated like $1 million client when it comes to things like fees and whatnot. Under our platform, even though we leave the retirement assets on the US platform and the regular assets are in Canada, we combine all the assets for fee purposes. So now you're getting the advantage of perhaps paying lower fees because you have more combined dollars in one place.
Right. Okay, well, listen, that was great. What I'm going to do again is I'm going to leave Harp's information down in the bottom. You can also probably post your questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to kind of monitor them. I will bring Harp into coming over and having a look at any questions that come up in the comments. Or you can email both him or I with the question. I can make sure I get it to him, but probably best just to go right to him. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving a like, subscribe. You can ring the little bell to let you know when more of these are coming in. And remember, during challenging times, it's great to access the expertise of advisors. And so if you're a Canadian thinking about moving home or inheriting money or all that stuff, it's good to have someone like Harp in your pocket that you can call on when it's required. Anyway, thanks for watching. Remember, gladiators eat first, and I will see you in the next video.